Who are we? Well, we're a travel agency. We've been in operation since 1970. You know, usual story. We started in one room on the Earls Court Road in the good old days in the 70s when it was full of Australians and New Zealanders primarily who were looking to travel overland. My boss had come out of the army and he got involved in setting up a company to help those people make the journey primarily from London to Kathmandu. A lot of history in between, but bringing us up to where we are now. We're a flight and tailor-made travel specialist operating in multiple locations in the UK and Ireland. We have some business interests in Australia, but the core travel business is in the UK and Ireland. Most recently got into some newer areas for us. Cruise and cruising seems to be incredibly popular with people, and we're getting more and more involved in that. And generally more and more involved in tailor-made arrangements of one description or another, very specific, personalised itineraries. The key things, particularly from the point of view of this presentation, are that we're not involved in e-commerce or online booking, and that's critical to the description of the project because it informs everything that we do. The telephone is our lifeblood. It's between 80 and 90% of all of our sales. We do have 28 locations around the UK, but around about 20, I mean, it varies from different locations. If you, in Belfast, for example, around about 30% of clients come into the shop. Somewhere like Cambridge or Oxford, it's like 10 or 15%. But you get the gist. The telephone is absolutely critical to us. There is no fallback to a e-booking engine or online commerce. And personalisation and customer service, well, everyone's into that, but that has become particularly important to us, I suppose, since lots of factors, but most definitely the advent of the internet, because we're now competing against these huge online booking engines that you'll all be familiar with, and we have to differentiate. We have to offer something that they can't, and you know, primarily what that boils down to is a person and a voice on the end of the telephone. Well, either a person in a physical location or a voice on the end of the telephone. Impressive as the technology is with a lot of online travel companies, they struggle to offer that. And that's very much what our model is about, and it's critical to the implementation of the centralised telephony platform that we've done with Britannic. Right down at the bottom is probably one of the most important elements for us, is this idea, which again I appreciate doesn't translate to all businesses, but this idea of answering, of advertising and answering local numbers. So we have 28 locations throughout the UK and Ireland, and it's very important to us that each of those locations has telephone numbers attached to it that are recognisable as being phone numbers from that area. So that somebody in Glasgow can look in our advert or on the website and telephone an 0141 number. Gosh, I should know that off by heart. Somebody in, what's one I do know? Well, 0207 obviously I know in London. But the concept you get is, where possible, we want someone who's local to a travel centre to use the local number. If they want to, obviously there are some centralised numbers as well, but we've moved completely out of what was the old 0845, 0345 centralisation policy. So when you contact us on a regular telephone number, which you'll see as we get into the thing is a critically important bit of the model. So the challenge that we had, I suppose, coming up for about three and a half years ago was things were going well. We've been working with Britannic for years. We had fully implemented the Mytel 3300 solution, which you can see out in the hall, and it was fantastic. But what we had in every location was a setup which I'm sure most of you recognise, a PBX, and a whole bunch of servers to support that PBX. So that every travel centre that we had, even if it was relatively small, had this whole kind of standalone rig. Every travel centre had ISDN telephone numbers coming into it. Because we wanted these local numbers, the only way to present those local numbers was on standard telephony, which in our case is ISDN 30. So you could have a location with as few as 10 desks, And when I went into the comms room, there's like a full height 42U rack with a Mitel switch, an IVR, well not an IVR, but a 6110, a voice recorder, network switches to patch all the. I mean, you can imagine. You guys are familiar with it. Just a load of kit to run 10 desks, and then on the wall would be ISDN30 circuits, and then of course the wide area connectivity. So there's nothing wrong with that. It worked, but it was high maintenance. It was costly, and we were looking to open lots more locations and thinking, wow, this is it's quite a performance getting each one of these working. So what I want to talk about a little bit is the solution to try and centralize all of that and how that's panned out and how it works and in particular the technical elements of that, the technology components that combine to make that possible. So we'll talk a little bit about business continuity and the personalized service, and I'll probably keep coming back to this idea of local number and local contact, but with the ability to centralize and fail over. So what we needed was an integration of effectively a single call center across multiple locations, with this ability to deliver personalized service and where necessary a local service. So we're very big into CTI, I'm sure, like a lot of people here, very keen on this personalized service. When somebody calls in who's called us before, we look to match that number and screen pop it with our data. I mean, now it's a much more familiar process. The local Chinese takeaway knows your address when you call in now, and we're using similar technology and have done for years to recognize clients, particularly where they've booked with us before and been high value. We need very detailed reporting. We're particularly keen on lost calls. Well, we're no different there to any other organization. Lost calls is lost business. It's bad on every level. Bad for morale, bad for the clients, creates a bad client experience. Tracking and reporting that, and obviously trying to keep that down to a minimum. Contact center client, I mean, in the old days, again, I'm sure people, will remember, or people still running, the kind of classic contact center wall board, 6 calls waiting, 4 calls lost this morning, 28 answered, that kind of stuff. As part of this project, we moved to a desktop client for every user. Part of the Mitel software suite, which I'm sure they've got demoing outside, the Prairie Fire call center manager. So all agents now have the equivalent of the wall board on their PC. And that is displaying information which is either pertinent to the department or group they're in or to the group as a whole. That's been a huge improvement for us. I go right back to the days of people ringing bells saying, 6 lines on hold and all that kind of stuff. And, we've moved on apace, particularly where these groups are distributed across multiple geographical locations. If you've got the luxury, which I know some people here probably have, of, all your agents in one physical location, a lot of this stuff is not so relevant. But we're talking about calls being shared across, Glasgow, Exeter, Bristol, St Albans, Guildford. One call could be answered in Guildford, he needs to be transferred to somebody who's in St Albans. So all of that physical proximity disappears, and you're very, very dependent on a really good visibility across the whole system. Our greatest asset is our staff, apparently. I don't know if that's, we like to think that's the case. We're competing against online, so that's all we've got. When you get right down to it, most of you who travel, I'm sure you all travel, will know that travel as a product is very commoditized, like so many other things now. So our differentiation is not about price, typically. It has to be about service and presentation. And again, we come back to this idea of the human being against the the computer screen. So we're looking for personalised service. We're looking to recognise clients where they call in, trying to start the sales process on a positive note. Answer the call quickly, of course, is important, and most importantly, get calls to people who are free as quickly as possible. I know that's kind of very standard contact centre logic, but again, quite hard to do when you're talking about groups of people who are scattered across lots of different places. So the sort of obligatory diagram, which what it basically shows, I mean, I can summarise it very quickly, and I'm sure most people will get hold of it straight away, is instead of these dozens of, well, probably more than dozens of ISDN circuits dotted around the country with all these phone numbers coming into these different physical locations, everything that we do, both in and outbound, now comes into this cloud at the very top of the diagram, which is the BT SIP cloud. But really, in our world, it's the Britannic SIP cloud. And where you can see the NetX, that is the Britannic engine, if you like, that takes all of the incoming telephony into one central point. So there's no longer an ISDN circuit anywhere in the Trailfinders organisation. There's no local telephony installed. There are no local PBXs in every travel centre. If you now go to that same location that I was talking about earlier on in St Albans, what you'll find is a rack with a network switch, a router to connect to the wide area, and that's it. Oh, and of course WAN connectivity to get onto the wide area network. So all of the calls are funneling in through this cloud into the NetX infrastructure that Britannic have provided, and from there they're distributed out to the multiple sites. Now, what that translates to very simply in our terms is somebody can ring a Glasgow number, it will arrive in the BT SIP cloud, it'll be routed through the NetX infrastructure, and then the system has the configurability and intelligence to say, right, they called 0141, I'm going to send them to the Glasgow Travel Centre. Well, that's great. I mean, that's relatively easy. You could do that in a lot of different circumstances. The most important thing for us is there's then also the ability to instantly distribute that call anywhere else as well if we want to. So typically a ring pattern for us would be, let's try Glasgow for, say, 15, 20 seconds. If there's nobody answering in Glasgow, let's escalate it to Edinburgh and Aberdeen because the Scottish caller wants to be answered in Scotland. But ultimately, the Scottish caller wants to be answered. The priority is to answer rather than answer in Scotland. So it doesn't get answered in Edinburgh and Aberdeen, and so then we can have a whole kind of waterfall through other locations. In practice, and I'm pretty sure most of you would agree, actually what one does pretty early on in the process is just default to give it to everyone. We set up these kind of endless matrices of it's going to go there, and that, and actually pretty early on you go, we'll give these guys 5 or 10 seconds. If they don't get it, bang, everyone. So our call answering and call loss times have been transformed. Because we were attempting to do a lot of that stuff in the old days with multiple PBXs, but it was really kludgy and clunky. It was fall from Glasgow over to Edinburgh, but it was all being done across IP between different sites. It was, at the time it was quite clever, but it was nothing like the simplicity of this. What I do need to stress is the resilience element of this, because the nightmare of the old days, and some people might still be in this situation, is if I lose Glasgow, there's a power cut. I mean, I keep using Glasgow because it's in the front of my head. There's a power cut in Glasgow. So what happens? Well, in the old environment, I lose all my Glasgow agents. Well, that's not the end of the world. I've still got 27 other locations. But most importantly, I use my Glasgow telephony because the ISDN 30s are out of action. Okay, so I ring up BT and say, oh, look, please, can you divert all of our 0141 numbers to these other ISDN? Well, over the years, that got harder and harder to do, to the point where actually it's now impossible to do. I mean, I'm not quite sure what the current position. By the time we got the numbers diverted, the power came back. And we were straight back onto them and say, I'm really sorry, we drove you nuts about diverting those ISDN numbers, we need to go back. Well, none of that happens now. Glasgow could disappear into a crater, and the phone calls would keep coming into the cloud. They would keep being recognised as 0141 numbers, and the agents that are still available in the cloud would continue to pick them up. And identify, they can identify that the client's called Glasgow. We would do the prioritisation to Edinburgh, Aberdeen with a failover to the whole group. So it's in terms of resilience and business continuity, it's a completely different environment to the one that we had. You could almost, obviously we get all kinds of alerts if a site does go, but that number one priority of, oh my God, what's going to happen to the calls has just disappeared. I mean, you know, nobody needs it. Nobody needs to key anything into a screen. Nobody needs to do anything. The distribution just continues as it was. You're just missing those agents out of the pool. They expire until you can get mains back into Glasgow. The changeover was remarkably, I don't want to say smooth and simple, because nothing, you know, all of us know that if it was all smooth and simple, none of us would have a job. So, you know, I don't want to oversell the smooth and simplicity, but we were able to stagger it, because the nice thing is you're moving site by site. You don't have to overnight go to a model that says everybody has to go into the centralised infrastructure. So it provided a very safe and steady cutting over of lines from ISDN to SIP as we moved along. And that actually, in retrospect, that's probably the most nerve-wracking bit, because that's the bit that's where you hand your will and your life over to British Telecom for a short period of time, because you're in their hands to do the divert. And Britannic managed it brilliantly, but ultimately somebody in the BT cloud has to make that change. And, you know, touch wood, it went extremely well. So how does it deliver personalised local service? Well, the local service element, I'm sure you've already understood. You know, we've been able to retain all of that local telephony infrastructure without any of the headache of ISDN, with the resilience of the failure of local lines, and the ability to still advertise and distribute calls through local numbers. Business continuity, again, I think probably already covered. You know, this amazing ability to, I mean, we're operating our own telephone exchange. If you use kind of really old-fashioned model in a way, you know, we have a telephone exchange at Trailfinders. All of our phone calls come into it, and we get to decide where we want them to go. And, you know, by and large, that pattern is set and established and runs all the time, but it can be tweaked. So, for example, if, please God, it doesn't happen, but let's say we have another ash cloud crisis, which you can imagine for us was a nightmare, you know, the first thing we would do is just drop any of the routing. That would just go out the window, yeah? You just go, every single phone call that comes into the organisation goes to everyone immediately. Don't try and don't worry about whether they call Glasgow, don't worry about, because we're in a crisis situation here and we need to bring on, so you've got this fantastic ability to just bring everybody in the organisation into the infrastructure. I mean, for that matter, not that we do this particularly, but for organisations that it suits. I mean, the guys from Counterpath are here, and as an example, there are lots of different examples, but I mean, I've got a soft phone client on my iPhone. If I wanted to, I could set up on a desk here this afternoon and start taking calls. You know, you want to go to New York? Yes, sir. Yeah, if you know, providing I had some connectivity to the WAN. So the resilience angle and the distribution there is fantastic. Competitive edge meets seasonal demands. Well, seasonal demands is a challenge for us. I mean, this helps us tremendously. What it can't do is the challenge which I'm sure other people in this room face, which is we have these incredible seasonal peaks and troughs, which people like John Lewis and Marks and Spencer are lucky enough to be able to deal with by temporary recruitment. And we just don't really have a business model that allows for that. You know, we've got this long training cycle, and we can't just say to people in March, well, thank you for helping us through our busy times, but we don't need you for the next 6 months. So the distributed phone system has really, really helped us absolutely, I can't remember what the proper term, sweat our assets, that's the right terminology, to every possible available person during those, which is basically, I mean, unfortunately, like all retailers, we're being driven into smaller and smaller windows of peak business activity. So for a lot of people, it's Christmas, right? You know, they have 2 weeks of the year that makes or breaks the entire financial cycle. For us, it's from the first working Monday in January through to about the second week in February. And in those 6 weeks, you get this incredibly concentrated demand, which is strange, really, because people's habits haven't changed. I mean, plenty of you will remember the holiday adverts that come on after Christmas, you know, I mean, more so when I was a kid, but that booking pattern still remains. So in closing, advice for contemplating a move to a centralised group platform. Well, wide area networking and infrastructure is so critical. I mean, it is critical to all of us anyway, but clearly at a point at which you become dependent on centralised telephony, your distribution of that telephony becomes wide area network, and that is incredibly important. In the diagram you saw that we have a completely dual resilience path within the NetX cloud, so we can completely lose one side of the data center infrastructure and keep going. Clearly resilience is, one of the very few good things about the old days was when there was a power cut in Glasgow, you kind of thought, well, Glasgow's out, but the rest of the group have got their little Mitel 3300 PBXs that are all chugging away. But we'd lost that local telephony. The great thing here is that we can lose that travel centre, retain all the telephony, and bring it seamlessly back into the fold once things are restored. Further changes and enhancements. Well, I think we need to continue to refine call routing and get more and more sophisticated about how we distribute calls. We're continuing to experiment with what are the best patterns in terms of balance against local and distributing to the whole group. The NetX infrastructure continues to get more and more sophisticated in terms of the reporting that it can offer us. We've got a big project on the go at the moment to look at doing individualized call routing. So if one of you calls in from your mobile into the Trailfinders structure, if you like, we identify you by CLI as being a particularly valuable client, and we route you to some specific call paths. That's something that is relatively new for us. The ability to, we already identify clients at point of answer, but to actually pre-identify them and say, okay, you need to go and speak to this group of 10 cruise specialists, and to do all that dynamically rather than ask the client to press 1 for cruise, 2 for first and business, that kind of stuff. So lots more in the pipeline. Naturally, the Britannic guys want me to talk about working with Britannic, which I'm happy to do. We've been working with Britannic technologies since, I always say 1986, Richard always says 1985. Okay, well, we started with a home telephone system for my boss in 1985. The first one I got involved in was 86, 87, and again, fortunately, I'm not going to take you through all the systems we've done since then. But lots and lots of different PBX solutions. We've been working with Britannic. Clearly, after that length of time, you would gather that we have an enormous amount of trust in them. The SIP solution that they've developed is fantastic, in my opinion. Obviously, that's biased. That's what we're using. We migrated to the Mitel platform. I have to give a shout out to those guys. That has, provided by Britannic, that has been a fantastic solution for us. They were early adopters in VoIP, and particularly in VoIP combined with contact center technologies. So I can't say enough good about Britannic, but you'd expect that from somebody presenting in this kind of scenario. The data center infrastructure that we use with them is incredibly resilient. We've had I won't say we've had no problems, because again I wasn't telling the truth, but there is a scary moment with anything centralized, because if it's centralized, it means if you have a central point of failure, it all goes. Not just poor old Glasgow's ISDNs, the whole blinking lot. So there are nerve-wracking moments. The advantages massively outweigh them, and we've only had 2 very, very brief outages, and I'm talking about minutes, not hours, where we had a major issue with the infrastructure as a whole. So unless that changes, my view on it is that the advantage, it's paid for itself 100 times over just in reducing lost calls and call distribution.